Thank you all for being here. This morning I sent the following letter that I will read to you, and a copy will be provided to you at the end of this press conference, to Christopher Wray, the Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and I sent it to him today. Dear Director Wray, I appreciate and commend the leadership of Special Agent in Charge Gordon Johnson of your Baltimore field office as it pertains specifically to the November 15th murder of Detective Sean Suter. Special Agent in Charge Gordon has been responsive, collaborative, and has dedicated FBI resources to our investigation. In fact, the FBI, ATF, and DEA have all been embedded into the investigation from the very beginning. Acting United States Attorney for Maryland, Steve Shenning, has been equally responsive. Detective Suter was scheduled to appear before a federal grand jury the day after he was killed, pursuant to his knowledge of facts regarding a 2010 crime indicted just yesterday as part of the Broken Boundaries corruption investigation. I have been told by the FBI and the United States Attorney's Office that Detective Suter was never a target of the Broken Boundaries investigation and that no information exists connecting his murder to the corruption case. The circumstances surrounding Detective Suter's killing are significantly complicated by the fact that he was to appear before a federal grand jury the following day. I am growing increasingly uncomfortable that my homicide detectives do not know all of the facts known to the FBI or the U.S. Attorney's Office that could, if revealed to us, assist in furthering this murder investigation. I respectfully request the FBI to investigate the murder of Detective Sean Suter. Please contact me to further discuss at your earliest convenience. Sincerely, Kevin Davis, Police Commissioner. Any questions? Jane?
Investigation. I just want to ask you something. It's been, we're all aware that there are elements of this investigation, as you said. You used the word complicated. There is some physical evidence in this case that obviously would suggest the possibility of a self-inflicted wound. Can you comment on that angle and element of this investigation?
Well, Jane, I've said from the very, very beginning that we will follow the evidence wherever the evidence goes. As we continue to examine the evidence, we come up against probabilities and possibilities. We are not going to discount any possibility whatsoever. I would add to that we have physical evidence that suggests a struggle. The appearance of Detective Suter's clothing suggests a struggle. The radio transmission that is unintelligible, and the FBI made every effort to enhance it, and they can't enhance it. It's still, to me, a 2-3 second radio transmission made by Detective Suter that is clearly made in distress. And at the conclusion of that very brief radio transmission, you hear the sound of a gunshot. So the possibility of what you spoke of, Jane, is something that we're not discounting. If the evidence leads us in that direction, we'll go there. If the evidence leads us in the direction of a conspiracy, we'll go there. If the evidence leads us in the direction of an unknown perpetrator who we have yet to identify, and that's very frustrating to all of us, we'll go there too. So we're not discounting anything, but I remain committed to following the evidence, and the involvement particularly of the FBI and the ATF from the very, very beginning when it comes to evidence handling and investigation is important to the integrity of the investigation, particularly for the community. So it's not just the BPD involved in this case. It's the BPD, ATF, FBI, and DEA. And that's been the case since day one. Our homicide detectives are more than capable of handling this or any other murder investigation. Baltimore homicide detectives have been heralded for many, many years as the most talented in this country. Television shows have been made about Baltimore homicide detectives. This is, however, about who murdered Sean Suter. How did it happen? What happened? And this is also about having all the pieces of the puzzle available to homicide detectives so they can conduct a quality investigation. As I stated in my letter, I'm uncomfortable right now that we just don't have all the pieces to the puzzle. And yesterday's indictment revelation was an example of finding out information that I just didn't know before, and that makes me uncomfortable. Kevin?
To be clear, are you asking the FBI to take over your investigation or to also investigate on a parallel track?
To take over the entire investigation.
Which would conclude your department's investigation?
Well, certainly if the FBI agreed to take over the investigation, it would be my best guess that they would absolutely want us involved in that, but they would be, Kevin, the lead on the murder investigation. This request is a request only. I don't know how the FBI will respond to it, but it's a request that I decided to make several days ago out of respect to the Suter family, out of respect to the BPD family. I waited until after the funeral and after we buried Sean. And again, our homicide detectives here, more than capable of investigating this or any other case, but they got to have all the pieces to the puzzle in front of them to make that case.
Do you feel
Brian?
that your homicide detectives have exhausted every lead that they have been tracking down these last 2.5 weeks? And
No.
they're just up against the wall?
Yeah, Brian, I wouldn't say we're stalled or up against the wall. We've had several leads and tips that got us excited throughout this investigation, and they didn't pan out. They didn't go anywhere. So we're not at a even remotely near a place where we would say we're cold on this case, but we just haven't had that breaking piece of evidence or information made available to us that all of us, you guys, us, would expect to happen faster in a case like this. And that's a source of frustration.
So what do you feel that the FBI knows that you're not getting?
Well,
You felt uncomfortable, so why?
Well, the FBI is still actively involved in the Broken Boundaries corruption investigation. So it started with 7 indicted police officers back on March the 1st of this year. Another Baltimore police officer was indicted. A former Baltimore police officer who is now a Philadelphia police officer was then indicted. And then yesterday's additional indictment of former Sergeant Wayne Jenkins and revelations of other officers who were present during that planning of evidence is information and names in those circumstances that are new to me. So finding out information on the fly, finding out investigative information at the same time that you guys find out about it makes me uncomfortable that we don't know all the information that we need to know to conduct a murder investigation. Jane?
Can you say if there is any physical evidence, DNA, fingerprint, anything to link or to suggest a second person? Any objective physical evidence?
So the objective physical evidence, Jane, that we do have is signs of a struggle on Detective Suter's clothing. That's physical evidence. Physical evidence is also in the form of a radio transmission and a gunshot. Right now, there is no DNA evidence or other forensic evidence, blood, etc., that identifies the perpetrator. That's not unusual that type of evidence doesn't exist, but that's where we are right now.
Well, identifying a perpetrator or identifying a second person. I guess they're one and the same in this case.
One and the same.
Okay.
Jane, there is no, at the moment, there is no evidence that speaks to that.
Yesterday you mentioned that you would, over the next several hours or the day, request from the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office whether or not they had any additional information they could provide to you that could enlighten you on the actions of Brian Gwynn. I think there's another sergeant mentioned as being called to the scene in that indictment against Jenkins. Have you had that conversation, and have you taken any steps against any additional officers related to that indictment?
So, Kevin, I have had that conversation with the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office. They have identified The other officer, I believe, in yesterday's indictment, officer number 2, that officer number 2 has been identified, and he is still a Baltimore police officer, and I suspended him this morning.
And to be clear, that's Ryan Wood.
You can't discuss personnel matters like that.
The sergeant that's identified as only a sergeant in the indictment, he's been identified as well, and I can tell you that he retired back in June of 2012.
And this is from the 2010 incident.
Right. And, I guess the frustration for all of us is, we're talking about a criminal act perpetrated by cops 7.5, almost 8 years ago now, that we're having to deal with on the eve of 2018. So those nefarious criminal acts that occurred back then are haunting us now. And the necessity of uncovering criminal misconduct by police officers is often an ugly thing to go through. But I would rather go through it and identify people who don't deserve to be on this police department than ignore it, turn a blind eye to it, excuse it, or forgive it. These are necessary things we have to go through, and folks have told me over the last 24 hours, wasn't that back in 2010? Yeah, it was back in 2010, but it speaks to an issue, a culture that we have to do our very, very best to ensure just does not exist anymore on this police department. And that's sometimes easier said than done, but this is the pain and the process we have to go through to get there. 2 guys are in federal prison. I think one of them's out right now. But we had 2 people in federal prison for years on end on some trumped up charges. And that to me is just the ultimate violation of this profession.
Sir, you said with some certainty last week before, that Sean Suter's testimony that he was to give the next day after he was murdered, it was not related to his murder. Are you still convinced of that fact?
Well, I made that statement, and I stand by it because that's what I've been told by the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office. They told me then and tell me now, as recently as today, that they do not believe that Sean Suter's pending grand jury testimony had any connection to the Broken Boundaries corruption investigation. That's what they told me. They know that I have repeated that to the community, and they know that I'll repeat it again. I act on information that's known to me and that's communicated to me from our federal law enforcement partners, and that remains what has been communicated to me. Now, I understand in the community that those 2 things existing at the same time and the fact that we haven't caught someone, I understand the anxiety, and folks say something just doesn't jive here, and I get that. So in the best interest of the integrity of the investigation, I just believe it's the right thing to do to ask the FBI to assume the lead on the investigation, to bring that layer of credibility that we need when we talk about this painful case to the community.
What the feds tell you aside, knowing what you know of this investigation done by your own homicide detectives, do you still believe that statement?
I have no reason to believe, based on the evidence that's been presented to me, that Detective Sean Suter's murder has anything to do with his pending grand jury testimony. That's based on evidence available to me at the moment. So I couch that because during an investigation, you all know how things develop and new information surfaces. So that's what I know now, and that's what the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office believes as well, and that's based on their communication to me.
So mechanically, from this point forward, how will this work?
Right. So met with the homicide detectives, the homicide unit this morning. Jane, we keep the case and we keep marching forward with the investigation. We run out tips, we run out leads. We continue to ensure that every shred of evidence has been examined ad nauseum until that time that the FBI tells us that they want to take the lead on this investigation. I don't know what the time frame would be to that answer. I would just be guessing, but I imagine we'll get an answer from the FBI in short order.
I think this is a yes or no question, but you might find it otherwise. Is suicide a theory that your detectives are pursuing? Is that one of the theories that you are pursuing?
So I appreciate you giving me an out to not answer that yes or no. The evidence suggests where we go. So there are probabilities and possibilities. Anytime we have an investigation like this, we have to examine every possibility, and we go down that road. But based on our evidence and based on the investigation that pursues that particular possibility, there is no evidence that was probable. And you can imagine, Kevin, that certain things are looked at, certain people are spoken to, devices are examined, etc., that usually give police an idea that someone was contemplating that. There is no evidence whatsoever right now that leads us to suspect that is something that we have.
It sounds like it's
So just to be clear, so what you're saying is there's no evidence that you know of at this moment that Detective Suter was contemplating ending his life.
That's correct. And that's an examination of a lot of things available to us to see if, in fact, Detective Suter was contemplating that. Now, this is hard to
Sounds
talk
like
about.
that's one theory that, out of due diligence, you were pursuing, but it's not your
Absolutely.
lead theory.
It's not the lead theory, but we're pursuing it, and having that conversation with the Suter family before he was buried was something that I wanted to press pause on. And I have had that conversation with the Suter family.
Can you answer one question about the scene, which is somewhat really relevant to this particular issue, which is the location of his gun when I think it was a patrol officer that first approached him. Whoever was the first person to actually get close to him, where was the gun?
I can only say, Jane, that it was at or adjacent to his body. And I don't think there's any necessary conclusion that can be drawn from the proximity of his gun to his body. I think the further examination of evidence and the continuance of this investigation, a number of possibilities exist regarding the meaning of the location to the gun to the body. And I don't want to be premature and speculate.
And you said yesterday you wanted to have a conversation with the Suter family. Was that about handing the investigation over?
Yes, it was about handing the investigation over, the reasoning behind it. I don't want to go too deep into my conversations with the family. I can just say that they understand it, and I wanted them to hear it from me first before they otherwise heard about it.
Going back to your letter, you said that the department doesn't have all the facts known to the FBI. Do you think that facts have been held, or is that just the nature of different?
I think it's the nature of federal investigations versus local crime investigations. I think, federally, and we're all in the same profession, but we're all tasked with doing different things. And I think when a corruption investigation as broad as broken boundaries gets underway, the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office come into possession of a ton of information. And they have to make a decision what information they then give to the police department for us to act upon if that information doesn't rise to the level of federal criminal charges on their end. So there's a threshold. If it meets that federal criminal charges threshold, they're going to criminally charge. But there may be misconduct that doesn't meet the criminal threshold that I otherwise want to know about it, because it would meet an administrative threshold for me to consider whether or not police officers should still be here, absent any criminal charges. So that's always the tug and pull of it all. And we have great partners in Special Agent in Charge Gordon Johnson, great partner in U.S. Attorney Steve Shenning. And, we're not necessarily at odds. I probably want more information, and they have their reasons for not giving me all the information. And I think the main point of their perspective is that if we indict or criminally charge a police officer, we'll tell you about it. But my question is, well, what about the other officers who may have also been, let's say, complicit or knowledgeable of a crime? I have a selfish need to know that, So we can otherwise look and see if they're fit to be cops in Baltimore.
Or fit to be part of the investigation into Detective Suter's killing.
Yes, sir, absolutely.
So if you have suspended the officer number 2, has this department, before reaching out to the FBI, reached out to this former sergeant, or is it still involved?
We have not, Brian, and I just have to think about what our role would be to reach out to that former sergeant. Again, if there's a role to contact that former sergeant as it relates to the ongoing homicide investigation, I think that that's an avenue to do that. But if it's otherwise a inquiry to see if he complied with administrative policies and procedures, then we wouldn't do that because he's no longer an employee. But again, I'd rather have more information and more names and then ultimately not need them than to have less information and less names and then need them later. I just, I really have anxiety when it comes to finding out things about criminal investigations on the same day that you guys do.
All right, guys, appreciate it. Any updates likely you will see in reference to what we just discussed would be from the FBI?
Can I ask one more question?
Yes, sir.
Did you discuss the decision to request the FBI take over the investigation with Detective Suter's family, his widow, and if so, can you share whether they had a sentiment as to that or not?
So last night, I visited with the Suter family, and I told them about my request to the FBI, and I made sure they understood, why I was doing that. And their sentiment, they seem to fully understand the necessity. The more eyes, the better on a case like this. I've been in discussions with Mayor Pugh over the last several days. The mayor knows that I'm making this request and have made this request, so she's been fully aware and supportive. And I know there have been a lot of community and political interest from other people about making this request. And I hear all that, and I understand it, and I get it. But ultimately, the timing of my request after the funeral, we had to bury Sean Suter. And then the other part of the timing that made me comfortable waiting until after we buried Sean Suter is the absolute fact that the FBI, DEA, and ATF are already involved. If they weren't already involved, I would have thought about making the request differently and probably made it earlier. But they are involved, they remain involved, so we had to get through the funeral, and then I had to have a conversation with the Suter family. And again, they're already embedded with our detectives, so I don't think I lost anything with waiting until after the funeral.
Did you personally tell your homicide detective this was happening, and what was their reaction? Based on
This is a very proud profession, proud organization. Homicide unit is particularly proud, and I want them to feel a level of I get it that we need to solve the murder of our own, and I fully understand that. And that's a sentiment that exists on this police department and probably every police department in America. One of your own is killed, loses his life, her life, then we need to solve it. That's what we need to do. But there's also enough information known to us that I think when people take a step back and look at it, we realize that there are moving pieces in this investigation that aren't the norm. A concurrent federal probe of a corruption case that involves names that are coming up in this case, i.e. Detective Suter. So that's unusual. And I think when things are unusual, talented homicide detectives, they get it and they understand it. And I just left my office with several homicide supervisors and commanders, and I told them that if I have to personally speak to every homicide detective to explain the reasoning behind this request, then I'm more than happy to do that. But I do also understand any frustrations they would have about it as well.
Commissioner, has the medical examiner officially ruled Detective Suter's death a homicide?
As of yesterday, no. I don't know if that's changed today.
There is no homicide, so there's no ruling at all.
I don't know that we have the report. I've been told that the ruling is homicide and manner gunshot wound, but I don't have a copy of the report.
And I just want to be crystal clear here about what you're saying about the FBI, because what I hear you say is you think your guys don't have the information they need, and the FBI might know something that you don't know, they don't know. On the other hand, you're talking about the underlying and overshadowing corruption case that obviously has a tie to this. So I just want it to be, what is the reason you're doing this? You're asking the FBI to take this over?
Because our homicide detectives, some of the best in the business, some of the best I've ever seen, can't do their jobs effectively if there's a perception or a reality that we don't possess all the information that we need to conduct the investigation. And then there's also a legitimacy aspect to my decision to request the FBI. The community needs to know that I am willing, and this police department is willing, to invite any extra sets of eyes or resources, whether it's investigative or prosecutorial, to look at this incident to try to figure it out. And my willingness to do that is something that I think is important for the community to know. It's not an easy decision, and I think I've tried to make it as thoughtfully as I could, but I'm standing by it, and we'll see where we go from here.
All right, thanks a lot. You'll be best.